December 21st in the year 1968 that the Apollo 8, the first manned mission to the moon, is successfully launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, with astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell Jr., and William Andrews aboard. On Christmas Eve, the astronauts entered into orbit around the moon, the first manned spacecraft ever to do so. During Apollo 8's 10 lunar orbits, television images were sent back home, and spectacular photos were taken of Earth and the moon from the spacecraft. In addition to being the first human beings to view firsthand their home world in its entirety, the three astronauts were also the first to see the far side of the moon. On Christmas morning, Apollo 8 left its lunar orbit and began its journey back to Earth, landing safely in the Pacific Ocean on December 27th. On July 20th of the next year, Neil A. Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, astronauts of the Apollo 11 mission, became the first men to walk on the moon. On December 21st in 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 from London to New York explodes in midair over Lockerbie, Scotland. As a result, 270 people continue their eternity. A bomb hidden inside of an audio cassette player detonated in the cargo area when the plane was at an altitude of 31,000 feet. The disaster, which became the subject of Britain's largest criminal investigation, was believed to be an attack against the United States. 189 of the victims were American. Islamic terrorists were accused of planting the bomb on the plane while it was at the airport in Frankfurt, Germany. Authorities suspected the attack was in retaliation for either the 1986 U.S. airstrikes against Libya, in which leader Muammar al-Gaddafi's young daughter, along with dozens of other people, continued their eternity as a result, or either as retaliation for a 1988 incident in which the U.S. mistakenly shot down an Iran air commercial flight over the Persian Gulf. 290 people continued their eternity as a result of that incident. 16 days before the explosion over Lockerbie, the U.S. Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, received a call warning that a bomb would be placed on a Pan Am flight out of Frankfurt. There was controversy over how seriously the U.S. took the threat and whether travelers should have been alerted, but officials later said that the connection between the call and the bomb was coincidental. In 1991, following a joint investigation by the British authorities and the FBI, Libyan intelligence agents Abdel Basit Ali al-Meghrahi and Lamin Khalifa Fhimah were indicted for murder. However, Libya refused to hand over the suspects to the U.S. Finally, in 1999, in an effort to ease United Nations sanctions against his country, Gaddafi agreed to turn over the two men to Scotland for trial in the Netherlands using Scottish law and prosecutors. In early 2001, al-Meghrahi was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and Fhimah was acquitted. Over the U.S. government's objections, al-Meghrahi was freed and returned to Libya in August of 2009 after doctors determined that he only had months to live. In December of 2020, reports surfaced that the U.S. Justice Department would unseal criminal charges against another suspect in the bombing. His name, Abu Aguila Massoud. In 2003, Libya accepted responsibility for the bombing, but didn't express remorse. The UN and US lifted sanctions against Libya, and Libya agreed to pay each victim's family approximately $8 million in restitution. In 2004, Libya's prime minister said that the deal was the price for peace, implying that his country only took responsibility to get the sanctions lifted, a statement that infuriated the victims' families. Pan Am Airlines, which went bankrupt 3 years after the bombing, sued Libya and later received a $30 million settlement. December 21st in 1996, Margaret Ray, who with her husband Hans, created the popular Curious George children's book about a mischievous monkey, continued her eternity at age 90 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Rays, who were both of German Jewish descent, escaped wartime Europe in 1940 and fled to America. The following year, the first Curious George book was published in the United States. Margaret Ray was born Margaret Waldstein in Hamburg, Germany in May of 1906. She studied art in her homeland, then later moved to Rio de Janeiro and worked as a photographer. In Brazil, she became reacquainted with Hans Ray, born Hans Reyersbach, a fellow Hamburg native who she had met as a child. The couple married in 1935, then relocated to Paris, France, where Hans was a newspaper cartoonist and Margaret wrote advertising copy. In 1939, Raffi and the Nine Monkeys, a children's book written and illustrated by Hans, was published in France. An English language version of the book was titled Cecily G. and the Nine Monkeys. One of the monkeys in the book, who was always getting in trouble, served as the model for Curious George. As the Rays worked on the manuscript for what would become the first Curious George book, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party continued their rise to power in Europe. In June of 1940, shortly before the Nazis entered Paris, Hans and Margaret escaped the city on homemade bicycles, taking with them little more than a collection of their manuscripts. After traveling to Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, the Rays sailed to New York late that same year. Curious George was published in 1941, and the Rays collaborated on 6 sequels, including Curious George Takes a Job in 1947, Curious George Flies a Kite in 1958, and Curious George Goes to the Hospital in 1966. Hans illustrated the books while Margaret did the writing. Despite their partnership, Hans initially received sole credit on covers as H.A. Ray because the couple's publisher thought it would distinguish their books from the glut of female children's book authors at the time. According to the Los Angeles Times, barely 5 feet tall and red-haired, Ray said she occasionally served as her artist husband's human model for their impish little monkey. She would scrunch up her face, move her limbs about, or even leap from one piece of furniture to another. After Hans continued his eternity in 1977, Margaret went on to collaborate with Alan Shalleck on more than 24 Curious George books, as well as an animated TV show. When Margaret continued her eternity in December of 1996, following complications from a heart attack, a new team continued to produce additional books in the series. Today, the Rays creation remains a beloved character in children's literature. Curious George books have been translated into multiple languages, sold millions of copies, and spawned a variety of merchandising deals. Historic information revolves in documenting how this audio file